name is Thabang Serolela, and I just want to take this opportunity to welcome you all to our second Intern Tutor CPD feedback session. This is a session that has been organized specifically for the interns, just to give them feedback. And tonight we're having the team from the office, and I'm joined by Mr. Mokwadi Morano. And we also having representatives of assessors and moderators, and they will be taking us through this presentation tonight. We're having Zarna Booth, we're having Adele Nodier, and we're also having Prof. Nadine Butler. And we just want to thank you for attending this workshop, because the purpose of this workshop is just to give you some highlights on areas wherein most of the interns are struggling based on the assessments that have already been done, so that moving forward you will know which areas to focus on in order to avoid your CPDs being returned. And based on that, we're inviting you to participate fully. This workshop is being broadcast here on Teams. I mean, also on social media, on Facebook as well. And because of that, whenever you're having a question, please write it in the chat, because other colleagues from Facebook and other social medias, they can't see what you have written. I mean, the questions that you are posting. As a result, at the end of the session, we will read out all the questions and we will give answers to them. So we are not going to respond to any questions on the chat, but until the end of the session, so that everybody can have an opportunity also to learn from the questions that have been posted. And then we also have in the team from communications. They are the ones responsible for broadcasting this workshop, and we really appreciate what the assistance that they're giving us. And they will be there with us throughout the session. They will be managing the chat as well at the end, so that all your questions are being attended to. So with these few words, I just want to welcome you all, and feel free to participate. We would appreciate your participation we will appreciate your participation. Thank you. Okay, I just want to hand over to the assessors, that is Prof. Butler and Ms. Adele Nodier. They are the ones who will be taking us through this presentation. Prof. and Adele, over to you. Thank you.
Just hold on. Okay, good evening, everybody, and I hope I'm saying good evening not only to interns, but also to some tutors, because this session is intended to address both groups, the interns and the tutors. I think it's an exciting event tonight to be able to spend this time with you in this workshop, because this is the very first time, and last night was the very first time ever that we've run a session of this nature. And I think the interns of 2022 are very fortunate to have the opportunity to have this feedback session. So we hope it's going to be a fruitful session and that you benefit from it. And obviously from your feedback, we'll know going forward if this is a worthwhile session. Okay, we've got apparently 2 hours set apart. you've listened to Bang has told you, about putting in questions. We are prepared. If questions come up during the presentation and it's pertinent to the issue which we're discussing in the presentation, then my assessors there will stop and we will answer it. Otherwise, we will keep the questions to the Q&A session at the end. Okay, but if something comes up and it's relevant to answer it at the time, we will do that. Okay, unfortunately, I'm not able to control the presentation on my side, so you'll just have to, live with the fact that I'm having to say next slide, please. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so why this session? We know that in February we run all these intern tutor workshops, and we talk about a lot of things, all the ins and outs in CPD. And it's a very content-heavy sort of workshop. And we know that a lot of the issues, it's difficult to internalize them when you haven't worked on the system yet. And that is really the crux of this session tonight. You're in a very different place now in the beginning of June from where you were in February when we ran the first workshops. You now have used the system, you've submitted your CPDs, you've had feedback from your CPDs, and so this is in order to look at how you've performed, questions that you might have, with the intention that going forward with your remaining CPDs that you can get the competent outcome first time around and not have to resubmit. So we will be, this presentation is compiled from the combined experiences of all the assessors and moderators, and together we have identified common mistakes, common omissions. So it's not, we haven't pulled this out of the air. We've looked at how, as a group of interns of 2022, you performed and what were the common, and believe you me, what we have in this presentation, it's not something that one intern did, but it's these are really, really the very common mistakes and omissions. All through the presentation, we are linking what we have on this on here. We're linking it to the February system, the February, and we're doing that because we just want to keep reminding you that there's nothing really new in tonight's presentation, and we're hoping that you will go back and look at the February workshop. And if you haven't downloaded it yet, it's time to download that from Council's website. So these two workshops actually should be looked at in together. Okay. So as I said, we are looking at the common mistakes, linking it to the previous one, and giving you some tips how to do it better. So we've called these sort of the generic issues. They are not specific to a particular competency standard. And then we will also look at particularly problematic competency standards, the way forward, and then we've got a Q&A. So these are specific to CSs. Next slide. All right, I think I've dealt with most of these issues here. Here we've talked about that. The fact that you now are familiar and that you've received some feedback and that the assessors and moderators are able to share their experiences. Next slide. Right. So the good news is you don't have to just sit there and listen to me all night and listen to my colleagues. We have a couple of polls interspersed throughout the presentation. And the first one, we'd like to assess, how are you feeling now, right now, about the process? And throughout the okay, I'm sure we're going to get there we are.
Prof, most 16 of the interns are anxious, then 8 are uncertain, 2 are excited, and 3 are happy.
Hallelujah, at least 3 are happy. That makes us happy. Okay, anxious is okay because anxious we can deal with. Okay. Now, I see there are going to be 2 other polls. Do we want to do those now as well?
Yes, we can share those links now.
Okay, let's do poll number 2. Thanks for completing number 1. You're getting another link.
All right, I've shared the link for poll number 2.
Okay, so you're just looking now at your CPDs that you've already and how you fared with them.
All right, Prof, I've shared poll number 3 as well.
Okay, would you just hold off on poll number 3's results? And we'll do that when I come to the second part of the presentation, when we start on the problematic CSs. Then if you could share, is that possible?
Yes, not a problem.
Okay, so we will see poll number 2, and then we'll go on and I'll ask you for poll number 3 later.
Okay, poll number 2, we've had 22 responses. The majority have had both successful and unsuccessful. 10 have had no successful CPDs, and 5 have had all successful. 6 have had all successful.
Okay, thank you, Natalie. So I can see in the audience we have a nice spread there. So for those who have been all successful, obviously we're hoping that your intention of being here tonight is to make sure that the next ones, all the rest are successful as well. Those who have had all unsuccessful, it's obvious. And you know, if you really use the information in this presentation tonight, plus use the opportunity to ask questions, plus go back to the presentation that we had in February, and just, you know, pay attention to what's in those presentations. You should be able to convert that outcome, that not yet successful outcomes, into successful ones. And obviously the ones that have had a mixed bag, the same applies to you. All right, let's move on now and go to the next slide. It's also nice for me. I've got a good sense of who's out there in the ether. All right, I've already talked about the fact that this, as we go through the presentation, that we have linked whatever issue is on the screen here. And so when you see this little bee, oh, this is a cute little bee, little smiley-faced bee, we'll be holding up a speech bubble with a slide number or a range of slides, and that's to help you to find the matching information in the first, in the February workshop. Next slide. Right, the bulk of this presentation, we talk about the common errors and what they are, but it's not really helpful to you if we only tell you what's been done incorrectly. That doesn't make tonight worthwhile at all. But we also try, as far as possible, to give you some guidelines, some suggestions, you know, with errors or omissions, how to avoid that going forward or how to fix them. Okay, so you'll see that on the slides there's a red X, which is you know, shorthand for the errors, and on the other side you'll see a nice big green tick mark, which shows you, if you look at whatever information is under the green tick mark, that is the guidelines and suggestions. When I greeted you, I greeted the interns, and I hoped I was greeting the tutors as well. We have, throughout the presentation, here and there, you'll see the specific yellow speech bubble. Whatever's in the yellow speech bubble is a message directed to you, the tutors. because you interns are not in this alone. It's a journey that you walk side by side. And so we've got some, feedback to the specific to the tutors as well. So whenever you see this particular yellow speech bubble, that is for the tutors. And again, if we look at the specific slides for the tutors, it was there in the previous one. Next slide. Right, so we're ready to go now into the meat of the presentation. So to start off with, we're going to go back to the basics of the CPD process, which is the CPD cycle. And I'm sure you're all absolutely familiar with the fact that there are 4 phases to the CPD cycle. So we're going to look at each of the phases and we're going to identify errors and omissions that pertain to each of the phases in the CPD cycle. But before we do that, just a very important note here. One of the issues that we do find that quite a few interns don't pay enough attention to which phase you are entering information. So if it says reflection, don't include planning. If you're on the planning phase, only do your planning, only talk in the future. This is what I'm going to do. These are the resources I'm going to be using. This is why I'm going to be doing things. Don't include implementation on your planning phase. Similarly, if you're on the last phase, which is the evaluation phase, where you are looking back and saying, I had the implementation, I told you what I did. Don't include implementation information under the evaluation. So this is sort of an overall and quite a common issue that we find. So read again, it's on every page as you go through the online system. There's a reminder every time about what belongs there. But again, remind yourself, go back and look again at the previous presentation, what each one of the phases requires you to do. Okay, let's move on now to the next slide, when we're going to look at reflection. The most common error that we find pertaining to reflection is that there is no clear learning need. And here for the first time, you see the red X here and the green tick mark. So what does this mean? Pertaining to the no clear learning need, many of you as interns choose an incorrect competency standard. Sort of the worst thing you can do with choosing an incorrect competency standard is to choose one which is not appropriate for interns. And if you go back to the previous presentation, where we classified all of the competency standards as whether it's appropriate for you to do, whether it's a recommended one, whether it's a challenging one, or whether you shouldn't attempt it at all. So look at those again and make sure that you're choosing competency standards that you are able to do as an intern. What else do we find there under the reflection page? We look for a justification. Why have you chosen to do a particular CS? Okay, and what do you write there? We need a trigger incident. You need to tell us, well, I was presented with this prescription and I didn't know how to assess whether the prescription was valid. Or a patient asked me blah, 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 and I wasn't able to answer. Something must have happened that triggered you to say, aha, this is something I need to learn about. So this is really important. So make sure that on that reflection tab that you have very clearly described what happened. What was that trigger incident that caused you to choose a particular CS? Okay, so what happened? What caused, to identify a specific learning need? So, you can't just put a generalized statement that pharmacists need to know how to compound. preparations. We need something personal, some event, some trigger. So make sure that you've got that trigger incident described there. Something else around the learning need. Let us say you're talking about a learning need around patient counseling. Let's say you're talking about a CS there. I think it's 2.2 is patient counseling, or I don't know, whatever number. I don't get my numbers wrong. When you're dealing with a competency standard, there's two things that you need to be aware of there. There's the content. It's what is it about? And if it's patient counseling, it's about what is this thing? What is the content? Are you discussing a situation where you're counseling a patient about maybe improving their adherence, or are you counseling them about the side effects of a president, or how to use a difficult dosage form? When we look at those things, that's what we mean by the content, okay? Or the recipient of the activity is the patient. Most times you're dealing with patients. But if you only focus on that, that is incorrect. That is why it sits here under the red X. Competency standards is competency. You really need to look at and explain and provide evidence for the skills that you developed. Yes, obviously you can't talk about your skills development without making reference to the content or the subject matter, but really you must be talking about not how did I learn about, this particular, let's say you're doing a patient counseling with a difficult dosage form. It's not about telling us how you learned about this difficult dosage form. It's about how you develop the skill of taking that information and imparting it to the patient. How did you develop the skill of ascertaining that the patient understood and would be able to use the information? So make sure in your mind that you can differentiate between the content of a competency study, that which you work with. Yes, it needs to be there, but the focus is on what is the skill that you develop. So when you get to the evaluation, you look back and you say, this is what I learned. This is the skill that I developed, that I now have, that I didn't know. In your learning need, it's also about, you must describe your learning need in terms of the skill. So I need to learn how to be able to effectively counsel a patient on how to use an MDI, for example. Okay, so very important here that you're able to see the difference between the content and the more important, which is you need to be talking and describing the skill that you developed. And then the last part of the reflection, and it's on the screen there, where it flags you and tells you, reminds you what needs to be under reflection. It says, what do you intend to do with your new skill? Okay, so make sure that before you finish your reflection writing, you've said what happened, why you've chosen that CS, what are the skills that you want to develop, and also make sure you end off by saying, I want to be able to use the skill to do blah, blah, blah. Okay, so say what you will do with what you are. What is this learning need? You've identified what you don't know, and also tell us what you think that you want to be able to do with it. Okay, so interns, it's just a question. All these things are there. Use the resources that you have. There's another resource that's on the site as well. There are checklists. Those checklists are in the presentation from the February one. And in the checklists, it will say, is there a learning need? Is it this, that? Okay, let's move on to planning. That's the second page there. The most common error that we find, or rather, let me say, the most common omission related to planning is that the resources that you're going to use are mentioned, but you don't give the details. We need to get, you can't just say, I'm going to look in the GPP. Yeah, well, there's a lot to the GPP. We would expect you to say, I'm going to use the GPP chapter so-and-so, section 3.1 and 3.2 and 3.3. Okay, so make sure that you add that. You can't just say, I'm going to read on the internet and find an appropriate article. That's not enough with planning. You need to give absolute details about the resources that you plan to use. What are those resources? Give chapter, section, page numbers where very common, and where you know that you get only requirements partially met. It's because you've omitted to give the details of the resources. And then planning is not only about what you intend to do and how you're going to do it, but very importantly, it's the why. Why have you told us you're going to read that section in the GPP? Okay, so make sure that you include the rationale for your planning. And again, many interns are not doing that. Check it, it's in the checklist. It says there, have I included my resources? Have I included the details of the resources? Have I included the rationale for why I'm planning to learn this new skill in this particular way? And of course, your best friend in this whole CPD process are the behavioral standards, the BSs, okay? Those behavioral standards, you know, we've got the competency standard, and then below them we've got those statements, those ABCDs. Those are your best friends. And you should use those behavioral statements in every phase of the CPD. You cannot do adequate planning unless you've read the behavioral statements and you've said to yourself, will I be able to, is this an appropriate CS? Will I be able to meet the requirements of enough of these behavioral statements? So too, you cannot talk about planning. Your planning will be superficial and definitely insufficient unless you link your planning to your behavioral statements. So there's one thing that you all must do differently going forward, and that is use those behavioral statements right in your reflection. Refer to the behavioral statement. In your planning, I planned, you know, for BS, for let's say let's take a competency standard, 1.6C, I plan to blah, blah, blah. For 1.6A, I plan to. If you do that, you're well on the way to knowing that you're going to be able to do enough to meet the requirements of the behavioral, of covering sufficient behavioral statements. So these are your friends, okay? Don't ignore them because they're going to feel very left out. They want you to use phase of this process. Okay, let's move on now to the third page, which is your implementation. And as you know, implementation is simply the story. This is what I did. Okay? But in many cases, we find that the implementation, it's done reasonably well. There's a nice story there. The interns tell us what they did, when they did it, how they did it, which resources. But it's insufficient unless that text, that story, that implementation story is supported by annotated evidence. You can't simply tell us, I did this, okay? and, you link it to behavioral statement. Not enough. You have to have the evidence which proves what you did. Okay? So the story is worthless unless it is associated with a piece of evidence which is annotated. Okay? So in the text, you want to refer to the behavioral statement. You want to refer to the evidence. So your implementation story and your evidence must talk to each other. There must be cross-linking all the time between your implementation and your annotation. Interns, if you upload evidence and it's not annotated, you have wasted your time. Okay, there's no assessor that's going to accept evidence where you haven't told the story, where you haven't explained why. Why have you decided to include that piece of evidence? And you know what annotation, there are quite a few slides in the February presentation about annotation. And annotation, just to repeat again, it's basically explaining why you've chosen a piece of evidence proves and linked all to the implementation story, specific behavioral statements. And when you link and when you annotate your evidence statements, you know you won't find yourself in a position where you haven't provided for sufficient behavioral statements.